Darren Till was undeniably one of the most hyped prospects ever seen in the UFC welterweight division, and through a mixture of his dynamic striking, bold and brash personality, and what used to be a glossy undefeated record, it was looking like he was on his way to becoming a superstar amongst his peers. However, despite a meteoric rise in the UFC where fans across the world once touted him as a future champion, the Darren Till of today is a bit of a punchline, seeing as since crashing out of the UFC, he's now not only competing in influencer boxing events, but he's also been online begging for Jake Paul to fight him. In this video, we are going to take a look at how Darren Till's career might be the biggest fraud check in UFC history. After an extremely successful 12-0 run in the Brazilian regional scene, the stories of the Scouser dominating local Brazilian talent caught the attention of the UFC. However, Darren himself has boasted about having an illustrious professional Muay Thai record where he claims he went 44-0 with 33 knockouts. The weird thing is, there's absolutely zero evidence that supports the claim that Darren had such a long undefeated run in Muay Thai. Not only that, Darren's Wikipedia page also used to claim that he had a K1 kickboxing record of 37-0, and once again, there is zero evidence online to support this. I even found this highlight video of Darren online that claims that he had a 61-0 Muay Thai record. I don't know what to make of all of these unsubstantiated rumors regarding Darren's fighting career prior to being an MMA fighter. I just think it's a bit weird that none of these undefeated records can be backed with any proof. Regardless, Darren's 12-0 MMA record cannot be denied, and his fights in Brazil earned him a ticket to the UFC. And on May 30th, 2015, Darren was slotted in as a short notice replacement against Wendell de Oliveira Marquez. Despite taking the fight on only 9 days notice, Till would deliver a stellar performance, knocking Marquez out cold with a barrage of ground and pound elbows early in the second round. With so much hype surrounding him in his debut, Darren passed the test with flying colors. And over the next 2 years, Darren continued to build upon his hype machine by going undefeated in his next 4 fights, including an exciting majority draw performance against Nicholas Dalby, and then afterwards scoring 3 straight decisive wins over Jason Ayari, Bojan Velikovic, and Cowboy Cerrone. With the hype surrounding Darren being white hot and being within spitting distance of a title shot, Darren was set to face off against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson in a presumed title elimination fight. Not only that, this fight was billed as a matchup between two of the best strikers in the welterweight division, and although Darren was seen as one of, if not the most hyped UFC prospects at this time, Wonderboy was one of the most beloved fighters on the entire roster. All this to say, the intrigue surrounding this fight amongst UFC fans was through the roof. And on the night of the fight, after Darren and Wonderboy went toe-to-toe for 5 whole rounds, Darren was awarded the unanimous decision win from the judges. And look, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, this fight sucked. Both guys seemed to respect each other's striking a bit too much, and unfortunately for us fans, it resulted in a lackluster main event. And you know what? I also have no problem saying this, but Darren did not deserve to win this fight. And even though Darren had the biggest moment of the fight by knocking down Wonderboy in the 5th round, I still think that Wonderboy did enough to earn the win that evening. Not only that, a vast majority of MMA media sites are in agreement with me, seeing as 22 out of 25 of the biggest MMA publications scored the fight for Wonderboy. I'm just saying, if this fight did not take place in Liverpool, aka the place where Darren was literally born and raised, I have my doubts on if the judges would have given him the nod. Regardless, in spite of a very questionable judge's decision, Darren continued to advance upon his prophecy of being a UFC champion and was summarily granted a title shot against then-champion Tyron Woodley at UFC 228. And through a mixture of the fervent hype surrounding Darren as well as fans' displeasure in Tyron's fighting style, the betting lines for this fight were razor close, with UFC fans being split down the middle on if Darren would walk away with the belt. And lo and behold, on the night of September 8th, 2018, Tyron would actually make easy work out of Darren, choking him out in the 2nd round after dropping him and slamming his elbow against his face for 4 minutes. Not only did Darren obviously show some pretty massive weaknesses in his grappling and submission defense, what shocked fans was that Darren lost all of the striking exchanges when he was supposed to be the far superior striker. You know, it's funny, the supposed 44-0 Muay Thai prodigy was easily outstruck by the NCAA wrestler. But it's more than just the fact that he was easily beaten. The bigger takeaway from this fight is that Darren genuinely looked like he didn't want to be in there. Despite Darren's outward confidence that made believers out of so many fans, Darren looked like a deer in the headlights against Tyron. He only threw 13 strikes the entire fight, and out of those 13 strike attempts, he only landed 1 singular jab. I know that some of you guys aren't going to like me saying this, but this was a pretty embarrassing performance out of Darren, and even though I predicted Tyron to get the win in this fight, I was personally really confused at how Darren Darren let himself have that bad of a fight. And not only did Darren lose his first attempt at UFC gold, this was his first loss in his entire professional MMA career. And looking back at Darren's journey in the present day, this really was the beginning of a very prolonged end to his UFC career. After suffering his first loss to Tyron and after briefly considering moving up to middleweight, Darren instead accepted a welterweight matchup against Jorge Masvidal. And following his disappointing showing in his last fight, this fight against Jorge was seen as a crucial opportunity for Darren to prove that he could still be welterweight champion. However, this was an opportunity that Darren would squander in spectacular fashion because after dropping Masvidal in the first round, Darren then proceeded to get absolutely folded by a left hook in the second round. And the combination of this being his second stoppage loss in a row, as well as the fact that he got knocked out on the feet, really put the notion that Darren was a true top-tier welterweight into question. Because let's be real here, even though Jorge has always been a good striker, most fans have always kind of viewed him as a journeyman type of fighter. So the fact that Darren got violently knocked out by him really was not a promising sign. In response to losing twice in a row at welterweight, Darren made a major career change by moving up a weight class and was promptly scheduled for a middleweight fight against rising contender Kelvin Gastelum. And even though Darren's stock amongst fans took a massive hit after his previous two UFC outings, I think everyone, including myself, was very interested to see how Darren would look at his new weight class. Fortunately for Darren, he was able to get himself back into the win column by walking away with a split decision nod from the judges. And obviously winning is always good, especially in the world of MMA, but I'd be lying if I said that this was a good performance out of Darren. Honestly, the fight was pretty boring because admittedly both Darren and Kelvin seemed a little bit too timid to engage, and it just made for a lackluster fight. And if you think that I'm just making this up, well, I'm not, seeing as Darren himself admitted in the post-fight press conference that he was terrified heading into this fight, and yeah, he definitely fought like he was. Regardless, a win is a win, and for Darren at this time, ending his two-fight losing streak was really what was most important. Darren's next fight would be against former middleweight champion Robert Whittaker, presumably to determine the next contender for the middleweight belt. And honestly, despite a ridiculously beautiful elbow from Darren that dropped Robert in the first round, this fight really wasn't all that competitive. Rob would outperform Darren in all areas during the fight, and of course, there's no shame in losing to Robert, who was undeniably the second best in the division behind Israel Adesanya, but I would definitely argue that this loss, much like his loss to Tyron Woodley, highlighted that as a mixed martial arts fighter, Darren was noticeably several levels below the best of the best. Like, sure, it's not shocking that Robert was able to take Darren down and beat him in the grappling department, but if you're going to be susceptible to takedowns, then you better compensate for that by being the better striker every single time you step into the octagon. And seeing as by this point, Darren was outstruck by Tyron Woodley, Jorge Masvidal, and now Robert Whittaker, it just seems evident to me that his striking just wasn't good enough to compensate for his lack of wrestling. Anyways, Darren's career continued to slide downhill when in his next fight he was defeated by perennial gatekeeper Derek Brunson. Darren walked into this fight noticeably out of shape, and he would ultimately submit to Derek's rear naked choke in the third round. That's not to say Darren didn't have success in this fight, I guess. He did wobble Derek on the feet here and there, but like I said just a second ago, Darren again showed to the world that his striking just wasn't good enough to compensate for not being able to wrestle or grapple. And sure, according to Darren himself, he walked into this fight very injured, and that's why he looked as out of shape as he did, but honestly, even if Darren walked into this fight in perfect health, I still really doubt he would have been able to keep Derek off of him. Darren's final fight in the UFC took place on December 10th, 2022 against none other than Dricus du Plessis, who was a rising contender at this time. And unlike his previous two fights against Derek Brunson and Robert Whittaker, many fans actually favored Darren heading into this fight against DDP. And even though I personally did slightly favor DDP to win, I really wasn't confident about it, seeing as how sloppy DDP has always been with his striking. Personally, I really thought that this was a good opportunity for Darren to get back into the win column and maybe get his name back into the mix at middleweight. And fortunately for all of us, Darren and DDP put on a really dramatic fight, with DDP dominating Darren in the first round against the cage, but in the second round, Darren rallied and utterly pieced up DDP on the feet. And with the score 1-1 going into the third, the fight ended a little anticlimactically, with DDP easily taking Darren to the ground and quickly submitting him via rear naked choke. So with Darren's attempted comeback seemingly reduced to a pile of depressed ashes, and with his formerly undefeated record starting to turn into a bit of a red carpet event, Darren asked to be released from the UFC in early 2023 in order to pursue other athletic interests. And although he has expressed interest in the possibility of returning to the UFC in the future, all evidence suggests suggests that he wouldn't do anything special if he were to return to the octagon. Anyways, after being granted his release from the UFC, Darren surprisingly booked a fight against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. in a 6-round boxing match on the Mike Tyson vs. Jake Paul card, originally set for July 20th, 2024. But due to health complications surrounding Mike Tyson, it was announced on May 31st, 2024 that the entire card was postponed, and thus Darren vs. Chavez Jr. was cancelled. 1 week later, Darren called out Jake Paul on Instagram and volunteered to step in as Mike Tyson's replacement. This isn't the first time or the last time that Darren has called out Jake to fight, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. Darren would find himself fighting on July 6th, 2024 in an influencer boxing event against social media personality, and I use this term very loosely here, MMA fighter Mohamed Moody. And before I go any further, I just want to point out how incredibly depressing it is to see Darren's career go from fighting Tyron Woodley for the welterweight title to fighting no-name influencers in circus boxing events. Mind you, Darren went from being a UFC title challenger to becoming an influencer boxer in a span of less than 6 years. That fact is mind-blowing to me. Not even 6 years ago, Darren was viewed as the hottest up-and-coming prospect in the entire UFC, and now here he is in 2024 boxing YouTubers and TikTokers. On that note, Darren made it obvious that he wasn't taking this fight too seriously. He also made his disdain for Moody clear, as he called him a coward who really didn't want to fight. And honestly, Darren seemed to be right in saying this, because in the second round of this fight, Darren hit Moody with a light punch to the back of the head, and in response to this, Moody obviously tried to get Darren disqualified from the fight by flopping and making a show of the foul. And fortunately for all involved, Moody's flopping was not rewarded by the officials, and Darren was deemed the winner by TKO. However, once the result was called, Moody suddenly recovered from his debilitating head trauma and got in Darren's face, where a brawl promptly ensued in the ring. During the scuffle, Moody famously scored a takedown on Darren, which, yeah, really shows how utterly dogshit Darren's takedown defense really is. Anyways, after things settled down, Darren took to the microphone again and called out Jake Paul to meet him in the ring, while also ridiculing Jake's boxing career and the opponents that he's faced. And again, this is just another installment of Darren shamelessly begging Jake Paul to fight him, because Darren has had Jake's name in his mouth for a while now. I mean, even in light of Jake's most recent knockout over Mike Perry on July 20th, 2024, Darren once again took to the internet to claim how low level both Jake and Mike looked, and began calling Jake out to step up to fight him. And even though I myself, and I know many other fans, genuinely feel embarrassed to be seeing Darren so shamelessly beg Jake to fight him, to his credit, Darren does not seem to care what his critics have to say, and has been very honest about his desire to score a huge payday by knocking out Jake. Look, I definitely admire how transparent Darren is when it comes to why he wants to fight Jake, but seeing as how desperately he goes about doing it makes me feel a little bit sad. Because honestly, with how often he talks about Jake and makes posts about Jake, it just gives me the feeling that Darren himself knows how few options he has in his career right now. I mean, especially seeing as how his UFC career ended, it's not like he entered free agency as a big draw or anything, and I think in the last year and a half since being away from the UFC, Darren might be coming to the realization that his name might not be as valuable as he thought it would be. And yeah, I don't know, I don't want to call Darren's lobbying for Jake Paul to fight him pathetic necessarily, even though I totally could, but when you take into consideration that less than 6 years ago, Darren was as prestigious a UFC contender as you can get, it really does make me feel a little bit depressed watching him beg and plead to get a circus fight made. Alright, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. Don't get me wrong here, I'm not saying that Darren was a bad MMA fighter or anything. At the end of the day, he was a decent but flawed fighter who simply fell victim to his own hype, and that really is not his fault. The UFC marketing machine pushed him into the spotlight a little too soon, and almost every single time he fought in high-profile fights, he showed that his skills fell short compared to the true contenders. And I agree that it's sad to see what Darren's career has come to after such a strong and exciting start. I mean, he went from being the hottest undefeated prospect at welterweight and fighting for a title to going on a losing streak that lasted for years, and now he's begging Jake Paul, the YouTube boxer, to change his life. And to be fair to Darren, I think suffering as many injuries as he did throughout his career definitely played a big role in his fall off, and sure, being so injury prone not only affected his fight performances themselves, but also how active he could be as a fighter. But at the same time, I just really don't think that Darren was at all the fighter he was propped up to be. Because despite the fact that Darren's grappling always stood out as a glaring weakness to exploit, the reality of the situation is that Darren's striking wasn't as high caliber as it was hyped up to be. And don't get me wrong here, he definitely had good striking compared to his UFC competition, but his striking honestly just wasn't good enough to bail bail him out of tough fights. And this is why I think that all things considered, Darren is one of the biggest fraud checks in UFC history, because Darren was touted as this next level striker with an unbelievable 61-0 Muay Thai record, but even as a striking specialist, Darren's stand-up game never truly shined when facing the top fighters in the world. Darren was outstruck by Wonderboy, Woodley, Masvidal, and Whitaker, and all of those guys are great strikers in their own right, but that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here. Darren's striking was just simply a level or two below the true great strikers in either welterweight or middleweight. And if Darren was actually made to fight a really strong wrestler during his welterweight title run instead of coincidentally only fighting other strikers, we probably would have seen Darren's lack of MMA skills get exposed far sooner. But Darren was a hyped prospect that the UFC wanted to protect, and through a mixture of cherry-picked matchmaking plus good old-fashioned marketing, Darren was painted as a fighter much more skilled than he actually was. And when he was locked in the cage against the true cream of the crop fighters in his divisions, even Darren's bravado couldn't hide the fact that no aspect of his fighting was actually top tier. And seeing as I think that Darren's win over Wonderboy Thompson really should be a loss, Darren in my eyes went 1-6 in his last 7 fights in the UFC. And if we are in fact counting that Wonderboy fight as a loss, which it really should be, then Darren's best UFC win is either a boring split decision win over Kelvin Gastelum or a TKO victory over a Cowboy Cerrone who was already coming off of 2 losses in a row. So yeah, when I take into consideration Darren's suspect skills, the UFC giving him favorable matchups early in his career, and the true reality of his resume, I really do think him to be one of, if not the biggest fraud checks in UFC history. But in Darren's defense, it's not his fault that he was a fraud, it's the UFC's fault for turning him into one. Oh well, it's all good. At least his totally legit 44-0 Muay Thai record will always remain intact, right? Anyways, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.